We went to state for state. We went to it. Yeah, it was good. It was fun. Yeah, really good. It was the first set. They took my little guys to it.
Grab a seat and get started here in about 2 minutes.
Go minutes. That's right. 2 minutes. 1 minute.
Actually.
Do you need the other table? You okay here?
I don't know where it is, so let's go with this. You just don't want to sit by me? Is
No, it's okay.
that what you're saying?
No, I just don't want to interrupt you, leaning over the camera and stuff. Actually, Matt was over. Yeah, it's interesting. I notice out here, every year there's no parent when it comes to one dominant high school football team, the grade 1 here. And then at the next, and then that, and just, it's in small towns. Yeah, oh yeah, The ones we have athletes, and they graduate, they said.
Always.
Yeah.
There's a big enough. That's.
Well, exactly. They get a good times for people like you.
Yeah, 3 sets of
Where is St. It's a big house. It's kind of like, and it's big too. There's a lot of others. That one is the biggest practice area. Not my favorite game, just shared. It's got like the wow. They've been running like we have a team. Psychology. That's really my sister.
I truly enjoyed your sermon today. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, a little bit. Well, and your grandpa, the hello.
Yeah.
Just real quick, when, after my dad passed away, how you have the answering machine message, dad's voice was on there. Well, my mom changed it to something else, and I was devastated.
My aunt, my dad's side kept my grandma's answering message for a long time, so she might be able to hear it.
Yeah, that was devastating when we couldn't hear that anymore. So,
Yeah,
thank you.
I just have it in my mind. I don't have
Yeah,
a
I
recording of
don't
it, but yeah.
either. Yeah, so
I
anyway,
mean, well, granted, I've got some videos of my grandpa with my kids, but it's Scarlet.
okay. So got that.
But a little bit of this voice there, so. All right, everybody can kind of settle down a little bit and find your seats. We're going to go ahead and dive back into Bible study this morning. And it's my hope a little bit, at least for me, that we're going to have a little bit of fun this morning. So, and for me, it's fun because I like talking about politics a little bit. It's my former vocation before I was serving as a pastor. And so I want to have a little bit of fun this morning. But what I'm going to do, at least this morning, is we're still going to be in Romans 13, 1 through 7. I want to spend another week on that because I like it. And I'm the one with the microphone, so we're going to do that. But what I'm going to do is just kind of pick up where we left off last week. But and this is going to be a little bit of just kind of diving through the text a little bit about what Paul means here with what he says in Romans 13, 1 through 7. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that, but then we're going to transition into the third question I had us all thinking about last week a little bit, which was, what do Paul's words mean for us in a modern context? So we'll be transitioning into that. So again, where I want to pick up from last week is this idea of that every person should be subject. And if you're reading Romans 13 again, it's in verse 1. It says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. So if you're going to be subject to the governing authorities, is the microphone not that loud? I just need to turn it up then. Or it's not working. We'll see which.
Working, it's just.
Is that there we go. Now I can hear a little better. All right. So do I have to repeat everything I just said, or we'll just word for word repeat what you said, because we missed all of it. Yeah. We're going to spend another week on Romans 13, 1 through 7, because I like it, and I have a microphone.
There it is, something.
So we're gonna be in verse 1, really, every person be subject. I wanted to talk about this phrase and the meaning of this a little bit, again, about what Paul means. And again, we talked about this, but that Paul views all people as subjects to the authorities, and therefore commands his hearers to be subject to them. Or perhaps maybe even you could think of it as to submit yourselves to these authorities without adding any qualifications. However, though, if you're looking at the verb that's used here in the Greek, and I didn't put the Greek up here because I'm not Pastor Will, but if we're looking at the Greek here, the verb that gets used for be subject to is not one of the verbs that typically gets translated as obey. So it could also be understood as let him be under the order of. So therefore, be subject to does not always need to include responding in complete conformity with what is heard. Neither does it demand total obedience in every instance, but even if non-compliance or direct disobedience to human authority becomes a necessity for the believer, it is to be accompanied by the recognition that one still remains subject to or under the order of that authority, to that temporal power that God's given those authorities. And that their response to even choosing to not obey, direct disobedience, or even choosing non-compliance very well may involve punishment. Yep. That's one of the meanings. There's about 4 different ways that this Greek word could be used. And so, and part of this is and I'll get into this a little bit more when we get into the modern context piece too. But if you look at Acts, I think it's 5:29. I've got a reference here. Is the importance that even within Acts and the it's I believe it's Peter, and we can look up Acts 5 in a minute, but they make the comment that we must obey the gods of the laws of God, not rather than the laws of men. So at what point does it become an issue of governing authority that's asking you to do something that's outside the will of God? So it doesn't always mean direct obedience. It means you are under the divine ordering. And then this divine ordering is recognizing that these authorities have been put there by God, but clearly, as we talked about some last week, they're not always going to act in a godly way. They're not always going to use that authority God's given them in a right way. But they still have the ability to punish you. They still have the power of the sword, to call it that. So you could be put in jail, like the apostles were in the book of Acts. Sometimes they were put in jail for preaching the truth of Jesus Christ. Some of them were even martyred because of preaching the truth of Jesus Christ. That authority, that divine ordering of God putting those authorities there is still there, even though they're acting contrary to how God would want them to act as the rulers and authorities in this world. Steve.
Is it true that since God gives authorities, God should be governed to authorities If the authorities are responsible for the blood that is shed upon the citizens to the Lord.
Well, it's certainly true that they will face the wrath of God for however they choose. And if they do things that are wrong, they will face the wrath of God for it. And whether that punishment is a punishment that we'll see in this life, or whether it's a punishment that will come in the next life, we may not always know. Adolf Hitler did die eventually. He was defeated eventually. Yes, he took his own life, but. So with this idea of divine ordering too, government is not something that just evolved simply because we thought it was a good idea. I mean, granted, we've gone through a lot of different ideas about what it could look like over the course of human history, from despotism to monarchy to, communism to democracy that we have now, or representative form of government. We've had lots of different iterations of how it's been structured, but the overall idea of having a divine ordering of authority is God's doing. It's a gift from God. And again, this then means too that all authorities have a derived, all these governing authorities have a derived authority. It's not theirs and theirs alone to do with what they wish, but rather it's not one that they can legitimately claim as inherently theirs. But that they too should be subject to the will of God, subject to the fact that God's put them in this place, subject to the fact that God has put them, given them this authority that they have. And as we said too, Paul clearly acknowledges a higher authority from whom the ordering comes, and by whom each and every one in authority has been put in their place, put in that place. Yeah. I mean, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar last week. It took a long time for him to recognize it. Well, it's still the same thing, Steve. It's still the same thing of God's punishment will be upon those people that don't use the authority in the right way. It's just, we don't know. I mean, God, the punishment is God's business. It's not ours. We don't need to worry about whether or not it will be punished. It will be punished by God. It just, again, is, we may see it in this life, we may not. It may not come till after the second coming. So again, I think this is an important point. We talked about this a little bit, but God does not predetermine how authorities will use the authority that he's established them. So any kind of wickedness that you'd see within authorities is not coming from God. He's merely, we talked about the distinguishing between the person that's holding the office of presidency last week versus the office itself. God has established the office. God has even allowed Joe Biden to be our president right now. But however Joe Biden uses that is him acting on his will, him acting within that authority God's given him. If he's turning to God for help, then he's using that in a better way, or maybe a right way. If he's turning to his own devices or turning to ungodly things, then certainly he's not. But those are his choices, not God's predetermined way that somehow authority is being used. And but I think if you didn't vote, I mean, I think that's something about your conscience it's kind of outside what we're really talking about this morning. So. Yeah. No, I could see that, Steve. And again, but I think I'd be happy to talk about it more with you on Tuesday if you want. How about we do that? Because I think it's good stuff to talk about, but I want to keep moving with what we're talking about here because I want to get.
2016.
Yeah.
The Lord told me the spirit to vote. That was my civic right.
Yeah.
And that was my citizen civic right. So technically, it's not my problem with the presidency, because I didn't vote.
Well.
God warned me and told me not to vote.
Steve, let's do this. Let's talk about it more on Tuesday, all right?
Okay.
All right. So I've got a note about how rebellion, though, has consequences. Paul warns those that thus stand against the authorities, thus that they are standing against God and will receive judgment for themselves. And I think this is a really important point to think about, if there's ever any point where there's going to be direct disobedience or, peaceful protests or any kinds of things that we have the means to do so in the United States. Are you in a spot where you're standing against the authorities because you're standing against them in the way that the apostles did in Acts, where you want to follow the laws of God rather than the laws of men, or you're doing it because you're upset with some decision that they make that doesn't really have anything to do with the Ten Commandments or some way that God's calling us to live? And I want to get more to this about modern context and everything here in a second too. But this judgment idea that Steve was asking about a little bit, I mean, it usually again refers to God's eschatological judgment as judgment at the end of days when Jesus comes again. But again, we talked about this briefly last week, but there's moments that there's going to be times even that God could use authorities or use people to execute some of that judgment in this life. It's just, I think it's important for us always to remember and distinguish what I said before, that punishment is God's doing and it's God's business. It's God's responsibility. We don't need to worry about being the ones that somehow feel like we need to be the ones that would punish the authorities that are not acting in a godly way. And frankly, I've got a note here too, evil rulers do not face or they evade temporal judgment entirely, or seems like they don't receive the full extent of the punishment that we think that they should deserve. But again, we just have to be patient and trust that the divine judgment will come in God's time and in God's will and the ways that he will choose to carry it out. Any questions, thoughts, comments about any of that? Before we the next piece I'm going to dive into is about thinking about our modern context. Well, I think that's a really good point, Steve, out of love, because I think everything that Paul's describing here, again, going back to chapter 12, is about living the life of love. Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, but show your love by what you do, and by doing so, you're going to heap burning coals on somebody's head. So yes, you want to live a life of love. Harlan, did you have your hand up? Absolutely. Yep. So Harlan's bringing up the prayer event that Kara Sipe led yesterday, and just that she had a bunch of examples and pieces there about folks around the world that are facing persecution because of their faith, and they are facing persecution from governing authorities, even where it makes it really difficult or harder than it is for us here on a Sunday morning, when we're not nervous that the police are going to show up and arrest us for having Bible class or having worship. But some of those folks are in that spot, and so they are going against the authorities with some of what they're doing, but then they're doing so in a way that is still being subject to those authorities, and they may face punishment because they're having worship or they're doing their things, what they do because they believe in Jesus Christ. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah. I can't tell you where it stands with God because I'm not God. So I think it's just a matter of you continue to live a life of love. So let's talk about modern context. Let's talk about what it kind of might. I've got a few different examples up here. And we have to acknowledge here that Paul's writing in general terms to meet the needs of the Romans. He's not writing this as a dogmatic treatise that somehow legislates for every conceivable situation that we as Christians might find ourselves in. He does not face alone, let it resolve the problem when it might be right, if it's possible to be right, to rebel against unjust tyranny. What to do if there's rival claimants against the authorities that are there, if you have a coup or something like that, or if there's a rebellion. I've got the American Revolution up here. Doesn't distinguish between legitimate or usurped authority. I mean, there's a bunch of pieces about ways that you can think through this about, that Paul's not given the litany of all the different examples of what we might face in this broken, sinful world about how authorities might live, might act, might use their authority. He doesn't speak specifically even to the situation if the state asks the citizen to do something against the law of God. But all the New Testament writers were clear that they must obey God rather than men. And Paul's whole manner of his whole ministry, demonstrates that in the way that he lives and the other things that he writes. Still his firm conviction, and even the ways that he allowed himself to be subject to the Roman authorities, even though he didn't always obey. He gets arrested in Rome at one point and gets told to stop talking about Jesus, basically. And he goes out, and then they put him on house arrest for a little bit, then he gets sent back out again. And what's he do? He starts talking about Jesus immediately. He doesn't listen. He doesn't follow their laws telling him that he shouldn't talk about Jesus anymore. But then he gets arrested again and eventually gets killed. Carol. Oh, it would have been well before that. Even if you look at inferring some of what's there in the Tower of Babel, in terms of, there's structure there. We don't know exactly what the structure looks like, but there's certainly structure and hierarchy there. And there's even structure and hierarchy of what they're going on in terms of what things are happening before the flood. In terms of all the corruption and all the, the sin and the brokenness. We don't know exactly, Genesis doesn't paint a picture of exactly what type of government they had, but there's a divine ordering to it. There's an ordering to it, certainly. And the ordering, maybe even in this sense, starts with the family. When you look at the patriarchs too, in terms of whether it's Adam and Eve and what they would have carried forward, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and what they're carrying forward. That's the kingdom of Israel, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even well before they had prophets or judges and then kings and all the different examples of the ways that it was executed. But there was a divine ordering to all of that within God's working. Yeah.
Was considered a Roman citizen because they were conquered and under their rule or not?
It had to do with his birth. And I don't remember exactly where he was born off the top of my head, but he was born with Roman citizenship. Because of where he was born, because of whatever spot that the Romans had conquered, and whoever his parents were.
Or specifically born in or
within the Roman kingdom, so to speak. Yeah. So yeah.
Actually, the center of power.
Yep. So. So my question, I guess, when I think about modern context, and thinking through a few different ways that this might look for us, is how do we discern between the absolute nature of Paul's words that you should always be subject to the authorities against the other side of that of whatever objections or exceptions that may come into play in our lives. If you're living a life of love as a disciple and follower of Jesus Christ, and you're living a life of love that's modeled maybe even by the apostles and what they did in the book of Acts, how you discern, when is there certainty about the rule of authorities going against the will of God? How do you determine what that is? According to Scripture, yeah. But it's easy for us to misinterpret Scripture. It's easy for us to misunderstand it. I see a hand. Is that Judy? It's tricky because all of those things then become, in a sense, within the eye of the beholder of us as sinners to decide, well, what is cruel and unusual punishment? Or what is justice? Because in terms of God, the justice we deserve is to be sent to hell. And so even within the scope of how governing authorities may be acting, you may be really abhorred that, once upon a time we'd have, burning at the stake as an execution versus hanging or versus gas chamber versus firing squad versus electrocution versus lethal injection, and whatever way or means or method that the state might use its power of the sword to execute criminals. Which is the right way? I don't know. But I also then think about it within the context of justice needs to be defined in terms of how God defines justice. And justice is a matter of the justice of God is so far beyond anything that we're ever going to be able to do. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, strive for better or strive to be under, again, subject in a way that you recognize that all authority comes from God and that we certainly live under the will of God. We certainly live under the law of God, that we should be striving to live a life of love that is honoring Him and Him alone first. But it becomes really tricky, and especially in our modern context, Judy, maybe even you're thinking about, the various iterations that we've seen even within the last 10 to 15 years of this, of what is justice in terms of police brutality. That kind of word that gets used about the role of police, because the police would fall under this authority in a broad sense of what Paul's describing. I mean, these are folks that have authority within the state to make people follow the laws. Harlan, yeah. True. So Harlan's making the point, a couple of different things. One, there could be instances the police officer does something that's outside the law. So then they're taking the law kind of in their own hands and they're not acting the way that they should as ministers of the authority that God's given them. So they're not acting the right way. And then Harlan's also making the point that if we're living life as Christians in the ways that we could be or should be following the will of God, the likelihood is that we're not going to be running into trouble with the police very often. Steve, or well, sorry, Shane. This was written in AD 54, 55. Nero came into power in AD 54. And I commented about this a little bit last week. It's interesting, at least the way that I read about it. So Claudius was right before Nero, and Claudius was not very friendly to the Christians either. But the initial expectation with Nero was that he was going to be a really good ruler. And so Paul's in Corinth at this time when he writes Romans, and there's still this so there was frustration about taxes. There was frustration about a bunch of things within the Roman government. And I think that's part of why he mentions taxes in particular here. But there's this expectation that Nero is still new, and maybe he's actually going to be a really good emperor. He's going to be a really good ruler. You're still 10 years out from the burning of Rome and a bunch of the persecution things that Nero eventually ends up doing. The writing of Revelation, you could make an argument that the 666 is referring in some ways as a code to Nero and some of the horrible things that he did. But timing wise, Nero hadn't done nearly all the bad things yet that he was going to do. Doesn't mean that the Roman emperor was good, but there was some expectation that maybe he was going to solve some of the more secular earthly things about taxes, some other things that they did not like about Claudius. So what do you think of this? So I've got the American Revolution up here. I'm just going to throw this question out there. Were our forefathers, our founding fathers, right to rebel against the king? Were they justified? If they're supposed to be subject to the ruling authorities and subject to the stamp tax or the Tea Act, the different things that they were frustrated about, no taxation without representation, the folks that dumped all the tea into the harbor, some of the things that they did, were they acting in a way that they allowed themselves to be subject to? And getting back to the question of discerning between being subject to and whether there's then objections or exceptions if something's going against the will of God. What does everybody think? I don't know if I sound very un-American to throw up the question of whether the revolution was right. Yeah. So yeah, we certainly reap the benefits. Is probably what was said. So I mean, we certainly study in history about the positive nature and the positive, virtue, I guess, of Thomas Paine's pamphlet that he wrote. I can't remember the name of it now, but he's talking about freedom and liberty. We use those kinds of words. And we wanted freedom and liberty from the king. and from the tyrannical power and, you know, the things that got wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Yeah,
I think it's kind of hard to sometimes separate, kind of think of like what a framework is versus versus like a decision made by someone. I feel like a lot of people like to complain if taxes go up or they go down, or do you need taxes for certain services or not? So there's a lot of people who have these opinions of authorities. Well, why are they? I'll just use taxes. That's an easy one. Increasing or decreasing. Well, the truth is it's a balance that no one can ever really have a good answer to. So I feel like when I read this about subjecting to the will of authorities, when it comes to certain laws of like the framework, it's kind of telling people, stop worrying so much about it. It doesn't matter, you know, like if you're trying to have a society where people are able to live and live in peace and all of those things, there's going to be different decisions that relate to that. I think it's when leaders do things that are blatantly evil, perhaps, that's when it's maybe different, when it's completely going against the will of God. Kind of back to the comment that was made earlier. So to me, it's a little bit different versus when we say subjecting to the rule of authorities of do you pay $5 in taxes or $7 in taxes versus, you know, we're going to hang somebody for something that, you know, that they didn't do or something.
because they were a pastor in a church and they wanted to preach Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They complained.
I think, Jeff, you're making a really good point, and let's just talk taxes for a second, because Paul talks about paying taxes in, you know, verse 6 and 7. For because of this, you also pay taxes for the authorities or ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect, honor, and honor. Let's just think about property taxes for a minute. How many love how high your property taxes are in Lincoln, Nebraska? I don't see any hands. I got my hand up just to,
Say
you know.
hi, but I don't think they're high. That's,
So I've got Steve next to me and he says you say hi, but he doesn't think they're high.
but I'm from New York.
But he's from
so-
New York, so
so It's
compared to New York, we're not doing too bad. Compared to Arizona, where my brother used to live, you know, he was paying way less on his house than what we pay here.
But you look at what you get as far as quality of life for the citizens.
Yep,
I mean, yeah, our taxes are high,
yep,
but you look at the quality of our schools, the quality of our police department, fire department, all emergency personnel, the hospitals we have. Yeah, it costs us some money, but to have that, you have to pay for it.
I think it's a really good point. So Rich is just making the point about, and then we talked about this a little bit last week, of even, you know, it's kind of like, don't throw out the good just because you might be frustrated with something that our mayor does here, or city council does here, or governor does, or whatever the example is of the authority. But, you know, within our property taxes, you've got one, if you get your new evaluation and they do the assessment, you can go contest it. I mean, you have a means to still be subject to the authorities and say, well, I think this is too high because of the valuations of the houses around me. And you can go through that whole process. If you wanted to, you could not pay them. But I don't think that's going to go well for you. I think they're going to come after you and they're going to pay penalties and a whole bunch of things. So you've got a means to contest it. But then to the point that Rich is making, you pay into it and you might think, well, this is higher than I wish it was, or this seems high to me. But at the same time, then we have the expectation that the salt would get put down on our streets so that they aren't icy, or, you know, the potholes get fixed in the roads, or that the schools operate the way they should. And with all these things, we can all find criticisms to say, well, my street didn't get plowed for a whole week that one snowstorm, and it seemed like they forgot about me. Or the times you look at schools and you think, well, I don't know that the public schools are as good as they used to be when I was in public school, and, you know, you have frustrations about it. But again, I think Paul's calling us to be subject to in a way that recognizes that there's still good going on, even though some of the frustrations that we acknowledge or experience as we do this. Harlan, you got your hand up. Yeah. There's talking about stuff going up. I see another hand. Okay. Oh, Donis.
and our taxes we pay in Licking are probably 60–70% higher than what we paid in Columbus. But in Columbus, we didn't have any services that we wanted to have, so, I mean,
So again, you're making the point of, yes, they're higher, but there was good that you got out of them being higher again too. I mean, God's, even though you, again, as we look at our governing authorities, we certainly probably do not agree with every decision they ever make, whether it's about taxes or about a broad set of things. But God's still working through them as a gift to give us some good. Carol, yeah. I remember you telling me about that a little bit. So you're on your budget committee for your HOA committee and having to raise the HOA fees just because inflation's happened and other costs have gone up and, various things, and you're raising them to match those costs and still want to provide a similar amount of services from the HOA, I imagine. So. Oh, sure, the insurance on the building, absolutely. Steve?
What about people who have an entitlement attitude and never paid, right? They're able to work, never paid a dime into the system?
Well, I mean, you're talking about folks that might seem like that they're living off the system and feel entitled that they should be able to. And, whether that's some kind of welfare system or social security, disability, there could be fraud. Well, but what I'm saying about social security disability is I've heard of instances where people have fraudulently gotten social security disability benefits when they didn't really deserve them. That's different than somebody actually, when my dad was on social security disability at one point, so I'm not speaking against that as an idea. But to the point of whether somebody feels entitled to that or they're trying to game the system, I mean, God is the judge. I mean, I think, living a life of love, abhorring what is evil, but what Paul says there too, though, is also to help your enemy, to give food to them, to provide service to them, continue to love them, even if they are living in an entitled lifestyle. Or even pray for your enemies, as Jesus talks about. Praying and trusting and hoping that they recognize the error of their ways and they turn in repentance and not want to live that way anymore. So I think I had several different instances of, possible answers about what Paul's saying here in terms of be subject to and discerning the difference between being subject to, but the possibility for civil disobedience, and discerning the will of God and those instances. Again, acknowledging that you must be subject to the ruling authorities, but it doesn't always mean that you must obey. But it also means that we have a due recognition of the subordinate place that's part of the Christian understanding of life, and that, again, any divinely established order, any divinely established government, if we choose to obey because we're saying that the authorities are going against the will of God, there's the potential that you're going to face punishment. And even what Harlan mentioned about persecution that's going on in other countries, you certainly see examples of that. People that are even tortured or killed because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And I think even with what Jeff was saying and Rich and others about taxes as an example, and they might feel oppressive, or even in the instance with what Judy, you were saying about justice and the hope for justice and the strive for making this life better, and the active role that we as Lutherans can play even in the civil life of that this is a government by the people for the people. And that includes the fact that we have elections where we want to vote for better leaders, or that we should be praying for our leaders and can't be praying for our leaders, that, we've got a new Speaker of the House and maybe he's going to be able to do some different things that are better in a godly way that wasn't going on with the previous speaker, or whatever those different kinds of examples are. But to also then have a little bit of the peace of knowing that we are bought and purchased by Jesus Christ, the peace that Paul writes about, and living that life of love of, sometimes you're not going to fix taxes, or sometimes if they are just going to be what they are, and so you pay them, and you worry about how can I continue to live a life that shows the love of Christ within everything that I am and everything that I do, aside from whether I really like all the taxes that I'm paying, or how can I still live that life of love that I have in Jesus Christ, even when I see things that are unjust going on in the world. unjust that are getting done by our government, unjust that are going on in various parts of the world, and the frustration over that. And sometimes, and many, many times, we may not have a voice to fix it. You know, we've been in the midst of, I think today is actually the last day of the 40 days of life. And we've been active with that within our congregation. Beth Sprouse does a lot with it. There's been the table up over there and, different ways we're praying for the unborn and certainly the importance of that, broadly speaking of life too, not just the unborn. But it's certainly easy and I think reasonable for us to be heavy-hearted about that sometimes, about how long abortion has been legal in our country and, various iterations of things that have happened within it. And the wrongness of it. I mean, it's taking human life. But also then to know, here's the vehicles and here's the means that we have within our civil lives, whether it's Pastor Will and I being down there the day that they voted on the bill and he's leading the legislature in prayer. About the vote, about changing the abortion date from 20 weeks to 12 weeks is what they ended up doing here in Nebraska. About the legality of abortion, or maybe it's a matter of knowing that you can be out, Bev takes folks out to pray sometimes. Pray even in front of the Planned Parenthood clinic, and maybe that prayer by prayer, somebody would change hearts and minds to look at life differently and trust in God alone as the source rather than trusting in their own ability to act through these things that they think they need to do to have control over their lives. So I guess within all this, I'm not trying to say that we don't have a role to play in the civic life, because I think we do. But I think that in the midst of trying to play a role within that civil life, to trust and know that God's got it in control, God's got everything in his hands. And in those moments when things are frustrated, and in those moments when things don't seem to be going the way that we'd like them to be going, and we're still subject to those authorities, to trust alone in God that his hand is still there. His hand is caring for us. And certainly primarily our salvation has been won, and this life is not the end. Steve, yeah.
In my circumstance, when I was real young, I had a situation where this person pursued me and I didn't have any civil desire to be with them. And supposedly they said that I had children, and I'm gonna say real short.
Yep.
And the Lord told me, gave me orders in the spirit to risk my life a second time, not for her. She was not saved, she was serving Satan. He was an alcoholic and a Marine. And I was asked, are you pro-life? I said, yes. And the reason why I was pro-life was because she pursued me against my civil choice. I didn't want to be with her. She wanted to be with me. And if she had a difficult pregnancy and she pursued me against my will, when I didn't want anything to do with her, that's God getting justice.
Maybe.
For her not being obedient to my civil response.
I mean, for me, Steve, I think my advice would be is sometimes maybe just to let go a little bit of trusting and knowing that God's going to take care of it, that God's taking care of you.
Right.
And sometimes those circumstances in our lives aren't going to get figured out or resolved in a way that we're going to see. No, I don't think that at all.
But under that circumstance, if I hadn't been pro-life, if I do have a child, more than likely, if I wasn't pro-life, that child, if I do have a child who's on earth, I haven't met him, he's here because I was pro-life. Because more than likely, those other people, the other parents, didn't want to have a baby.
So I want to dip my toe into one last thing for the last few minutes. I'm gonna dip my toe in because it's just the way I am. So submission to governing authority can coexist with disobedience to the government in certain exceptional circumstances. These circumstances are situations where the government commands one to do something that is clearly contrary to the word of God, or when rulers prohibit allegiance to Christ alone. So here's what I want to dip my toe into. In March 29th, 2020, our governor says we can't have worship. And we ended up not having worship here on our campus until May 14th or whatever it was. 6 weeks or whatever it was. I don't remember the exact time frame. Talking about COVID. So I'm dipping my toe into the thing that's hard for maybe people to talk about still. I was president of the congregation at the time. And I remember asking Pastor Will that week, I said, there's a means that I can go to the public health department and object to this. And I was ready to. to say what you're doing is wrong against the word of God. I mean, Hebrews talks about do not, you know, pattern about not, you know, still gathering together for worship. I can't quote it off the top of my head. But for me, it felt like a juxtaposition, a point of, do I trust in God alone enough that if I come here and worship Him on a Sunday morning, which He says to do, am I still going to be okay? As Pastor Will and I talked about it, we said, you know, given the fear and the uncertainty of everything going on right now, two things might happen. One, we're going to lose if you try to appeal it anyway. And what good does that do? And two, it was the question of, are we as a congregation of faith ready to be civilly disobedient and have worship anyway? So what I'm dipping my toe into is that question of, are there exceptions to the rule of submitting to authority? As we look back, you know, 3.5 years later, do you think that this is the point that we should have said, we're going to have worship anyway because God says we should? I hear one yes. It's easy to say in hindsight. Any thoughts about any of this? I've only got a few minutes, but yeah, Fred.
Circumvent. Like,
So Fred's talking about how we circumvented it. We went to a Zoom style service. We had the Zoom Bible study. And then if you remember, we also had the Saturdays where Pastor Will and Pastor Gary were here all days. And we only had 10 people in the room and you could have a short communion service.
Found a way.
So we found ways around the laws as they are written. You know, and I remember even actually, I don't know if I've told everybody this, but the health department got even upset with what we were doing on Saturday mornings at one point. And I had a conversation with the head of the health department as president of the congregation. I had a conversation with somebody else at the health department, told them what we were doing, told them how they were doing. And they said, oh, well, it looks like you're actually not only following the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. So they didn't come down on us. But somebody got upset that we were even having our communion services on Saturday. Everybody was afraid. Everybody was scared. It was the sky, you know, it's Chicken Little kind of at that point. It was hard to know what to make sense about how we feel. But I'll tell you, as at that point, the president of the congregation, I was ready to go fight to say we should be able to have worship on Sunday mornings. But that's how strongly I felt about it, that if we're saying that we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ alone, and He says that worship is important, we should do it in spite of the fact that our mayor and our public health department has said that you can't get together for worship, or our governor really is the one that said it. Mayor and public health department followed it, or whichever way it went. Yeah. Amen. And I've thought about this too. So talking about the ways that God blessed it, the moments of COVID and the ways that things have happened here at Faith is us trying to adjust and to adapt, you know, going to online worship, going to the fact that we've got, I was just talking with somebody the other day about it, that we record our Bible studies on Sunday morning on Teams now, and we've continued to do that. If you want to go back and do the Revelation Bible study again, you can. That didn't exist before COVID, before the shutdown. And we continue to do that, where we record these each week. And that's a great blessing. If you want to go back and watch worship services for the last 3.5 years, you can. And, you know, the point made here too is just that, you know, maybe you're out of town, maybe you're sick at home and you can't make it to worship on Sunday morning. You can watch online at 10:30. Yeah. Yeah, it's not just our congregation. Yeah. People from wherever you're at can tune in and see our worship services, join our Bible studies if they want to, all those kinds of things. And yes, and I mean, it's an amazing way that God works in spite of really, really difficult, uncertain circumstances of, again, March 29, 2020, and you think the sky is falling. How are we going to handle all this? How sick is everybody going to get? All those kinds of things. God's still being at work to take and work through this to bless not only this congregation, but so many others. I thought about it because it's a really palpable example for me of, was this a moment when our governing ruling authorities were asking us to do something that was against the will of God? My personal opinion was yes. Not worshiping is against the will of God. We found ways to worship. Again, we found ways to do it. Yes.
leave the state, I leave the country,
Yeah,
and I survived it.
sounds good to me, Steve. Any other final thoughts? I'm already a few minutes over, but I didn't want to cut this off if people had things that were pressing on their minds or hearts or whichever else it is. All right, we'll be back next week. Pastor Will had a surgery Friday. He thinks he might be here next week, but we'll see how he's doing. So, I mean, it's definitely possible he'll be here next week, but we'll see how he does this week. So you may have me, you may have him. We'll continue through the finish of Romans 13, Romans 14 next week. See y'all next week. You didn't say anything.
I was thinking, how do you think it relates to like Ephesians 6? The scope of the whole armor of God.